Gagne's 9 Events of Instruction. This is a tool that every instructor would be wise to have in their toolbox. You'll most likely find that you already use these ideas in your teaching. However, when we intentionally apply this framework, we can streamline the design and delivery of an effective class session. So, Gagne defined 9 events of instruction. Essentially, the first 3 events get the learner warmed up, the next 3 prepare and practice the learner, and the final 3 help refine that practice for use in the real world. For our intents and purposes, we will consolidate each group into 3 phases: prime, learn, and reinforce. Gagne did not define these phases, but we will be using them as a way to chunk the events so you can better remember them later on. In the prime phase, the objective is to alert, focus, and activate your learners' minds by gaining attention, stating objectives, and stimulating recall. Priming sets up the necessary mental conditions for more meaningful learning to take place. So, in the first event, gain attention, our job is to pique interest with an activity, brain teaser, story, demonstration, or common problems and misconceptions around the topic of the lesson. When we select a means of gaining attention, it helps to achieve 2 things. First, do your best to make it participatory. Get your students moving and thinking right away to give them a sense of involvement. And second, make it relevant to the lesson. If you can't make it both, aim for relevancy. It is paramount that your attention grabber is relevant to the learning. One element of the prime phase is to establish that this experience will be useful. So some traditional icebreakers, like 2 truths and a lie, for example, may be a good way to get everyone involved and comfortable at the beginning of a class, but it may be a waste of their time if it's not really related to the content. The second event in the prime phase is state objectives. Of course, tell students what they're about to learn. Objectives act as a compass for learners, but it's important to explain your objectives in a way students might be able to relate to them. From the point of view of the instructor, objectives are meant to inform the development of assessments and resources. However, from the student's point of view, objectives should provide direction and demonstrate value. So, after stating a learning objective, it's helpful to rephrase it into more real-world terms. For example, let's say we're teaching a class on Photoshop. An objective might be, apply 3 editing tools given a set of old photographs. You could effectively rephrase that in terms of the objective's real-world applications. For instance, you could explain, this is how people remove themselves from embarrassing photos or make themselves much better looking than they actually are. Objectives should be specific, measurable, and observable, but also humanizing them can create meaning around them for the learner. And that leads us to the third event of the prime phase: stimulate recall. Here, it is important to set up some kind of activity where students must associate the ideas they are about to cover with things that they already know. This will help new ideas stick in the learner's mind and enable deeper processing of information. This is a key factor in enhancing the learning process. Essentially, prior knowledge is pulled from long-term memory into working memory. This brings to the surface what we already know about something. So external information has something it can attach to in a meaningful way. When that happens, learning starts to take place. And as more associations are made, that information is then encoded into long-term memory as knowledge. So, clearly, the deliberate recall of prior knowledge is highly impactful. Now, we can do this by asking questions that require students to draw on their experiences. We can task the learner to map their general knowledge around a topic, or we can promote analogical thinking by introducing concepts or stories that your learners are most likely already familiar with. So, thinking about the prime phase as a whole, pause the video and jot down some ways you already do this in your classes. Now that we've covered the prime phase, we will continue to the learn phase. These next 3 events, present content, provide guidance, and elicit performance, empower students to cultivate the skills, knowledge, and attitudes aligned with stated objectives. The first event in this phase is present content. Here, we provide students with the necessary and sufficient content material. As such, we need to be sure to separate the need to know from the nice to know. Our primary goal here is to simplify complex information for easier understanding, not to overload learners with what they will have to make sense of all by themselves. So it is important to present content in digestible chunks as well as in multiple modes. This creates an enriched network of associations. For the creation of slide decks and other multimedia, we highly recommend referring to Richard Mayer's 12 multimedia learning principles. Once we've presented content, we need to provide guidance through it. Here, we can provide concept models, worked examples, and advanced organizers for how these skills, knowledge, and attitudes can be successfully applied. This is also a great time to check comprehension by using polls and short discussions. In addition, try to provide learners with useful mnemonics and study strategies that your learners can use to master the content more efficiently. This helps lower anxiety and build confidence for a smooth transition to the next event, elicit performance. This is where we facilitate practice exercises, more directed discussions, scenarios, and simulations, which all require the use of tools and information covered up to that point. This is where we empower students to fail and improve, guide inquiry, and facilitate collaboration. Here, the changes in long-term memory begin to take on a deeper meaning, expand the learner's knowledge base, and increase their skill level. Pause the video and jot down a couple examples of how you approach this phase in your own classes. This brings us to the final phase, reinforce. The events provide feedback, assess performance, and enhance retention and transfer, help refine and consolidate the skills, knowledge, and attitudes in the learner's mind, and support the application of ideas to the real world. The first event of this phase actually weaves through the other events, and that is provide feedback. It's helpful to have a measure of feedback threaded throughout the lesson to guide student adjustments. This is called concurrent feedback. However, it is highly impactful to provide whole class feedback on common issues and muddiest points after everyone has had a chance to practice, fail, and try again. This is called terminal feedback. There are many different approaches to both concurrent and terminal feedback, and those will be covered later in this course. For now, be conscious to bake in a sufficient amount of time to provide feedback. After feedback comes the event, assess performance. Here we can task students with an assessment to demonstrate that they have met the objectives stated at the beginning of the session. The nature of this assessment, whether it's knowledge, skills, or both, depends wholly on our objectives. Going back to our example of the Photoshop lesson, if a student successfully removed an unwanted element from an old photo, then they have met the objective of using 3 editing tools to some degree. Both success and failure are expected here. This gives learners a sense of where they are compared to where they need to be, and it allows instructors to identify any common pain points to target moving forward. Once performance has been assessed, it is very important to enhance retention and transfer. It helps immensely to give students time to reflect on what was experienced, concepts, processes, mistakes, feedback, and how it maps to use in real life. Some call this an after-action review. Journaling also works well for retention and transfer. But also, after the session, low-stakes quizzes will boost memory, what-if scenarios will enable transfer, and a one-page summary or job aid that learners can reference for future use will increase the likelihood of students applying what they learned in class to situations in the real world. This event helps you actively bridge the experience from the controlled learning environment to an authentic experience in the wild. Pause the video to take a moment and reflect on how you do this already in your sessions. Also, brainstorm some adjustments or additions you could make to boost efficacy. So, that's the 9 events. Gain attention, state objectives, stimulate recall, present content, provide guidance, elicit performance, provide feedback, assess performance, enhance retention, and transfer. We've chunked these into 3 phases: prime, learn, and reinforce. Keep in mind that this is not a prescription. You are not required to follow it to the letter. It's just a useful framework to help you think more intentionally about how you plan your class sessions. You can combine events or even omit some if you don't feel they are completely necessary. At the end of the day, it is your class, and this is just one tool to help you plan and facilitate it.